So what is a key control and why does this concept matter? Who cares? Well, a key control is one that you are relying upon to address a risk that you're concerned about. It's one that, if it fails, represents an unacceptable level of risk to the objective that you're concerned with, whether that be for SOX or for some kind of business risk. So it's a key control is something that has to be in place and it has to be operating consistently and appropriately as needed to address the risk. So let me explain this concept a little bit better by telling you a story. The theme of all of my videos on this channel. So when I was at Maxtor Corporation, which was a global manufacturer of hard drives used in computers of all kinds, from laptops to the largest telecom equipment. And I was in Singapore, and we were looking at controls over many of the financial functions. And one of those was in the accounts receivable and general ledger area, run by a rather lovely lady who I thought was delightful. She was really outstanding in her work. She was highly dedicated, very professional, very diligent, and she really cared about her work. And as you might imagine, every time we did any kind of testing of the controls in her area, they were flawless. One year, I went to her and I said, I've forgotten her name, it was, let's say Cheryl. Cheryl, I need to talk to you about the controls because we're changing the scope of the controls we're testing in your area. And she said, oh. I said, yeah, I want to talk to you because you are the owner of these controls. And I want to make sure you understand and you agree with the position that the company and the finance organization and management as a whole has determined based upon this top-down risk-based approach that we're taking. And this particular control, which was some kind of a review, I can't remember what it was exactly, we're taking it out of scope for SOX because it's not a key control. And she got quite upset. She was offended. She was actually quite offended that we were taking this out of scope because she said, this is a very important control, Norman. Why are you taking it out of scope? You mean you're not paying attention to it? It's really important. And I said, Cheryl, yes, it is important. It's important for running the business, but for the objective that we're looking at, which is the financial reporting and the possibility of an error in the financial statements that is material to the company as a whole, we don't actually need this control for that purpose. This control is really important in terms of running the business, in making sure that inventory and accounts receivable and then general ledger, all of those are correctly stated and the transactions are being properly approved and processed and all the rest of that. But we actually don't need this one because we have these other controls that provide us the assurance that we need. And we don't need to have these which are important. Yes, I agree. But we don't need to test and include in scope all of these other controls. We can just rely upon these one or two that we have identified. So we're going to take this one out of scope. And yes, it is important. And, you know, I've talked about this to your bosses and your boss and your boss's boss, the Singapore controller, and they agree. They have agreed that this is important, but it's not a, quote, key control. For this particular purpose, for SOX, and the integrity of the financial statements at the level of materiality, which we talked about before, is not necessary. It's not a key control. Now, this concept applies whether it's SOX or any other business risk. We need to manage risks to enterprise objectives at an acceptable level. We need to keep that level of risk at an acceptable level given the cost of control and the likelihood of an error and all the rest of that, right? So when we are assessing a control, we need to know, first of all, is it the right control to address the risk? Is it necessary to address the risk? And if it is, we can call it a key control. And then we can look at the design of that control as to whether it really effectively addresses the level of risk, addresses that risk at the level that we need it. Okay. In SOX language, we talk about a level of precision and things like that. But basically, is it the control we need to address the risk if it runs properly? And then we need to test the operation of the control. So SOX has actually taught us a few nice things about assessing controls. But whether it's an audit or an evaluation of controls over reputation risk or compliance risk, there's an awful lot of controls. We need to boil it down to those few controls that provide the assurance that we need. Assess those, and if those are effective, then we need to ask, why do we have these other controls? Are they actually necessary? Or are they just consuming resources that we can put to better use? Maybe these controls are inherited controls when the business was different, when different management wanted to over-control something. The key control is what we should be concerned about. And then the, quote, non-key controls we should be questioning. Do they really need to be in place? What is the risk that they are addressing? And is that risk serious enough for us to be spending that time and money on those? So it's an important concept, the concept of a key control. And it leads us to not only making sure we are testing the right controls to address a particular risk, but questioning all the other controls that management has in place. Perhaps are not giving us the value, the return on the investment that is being spent in performing that particular control. Because in the same way as SOX need to be rationalized, the scope every so often, it makes sense to rationalize what management is doing in terms of controls of all processes from time to time, and eliminating those which are not adding value, eliminating those that are not necessary to address an important risk, eliminating those where the value of the control is less than the cost or less than what we could be putting that same resource to doing something else, that's special projects, analyses, other investment to deliver value to the organization. So what I'm saying is, identify the key controls over the risk you're concerned about and ask whether these other non-key controls need to exist and why. And that way we can make sure that management has not only the right controls in place, but the right business processes, and the overall system of internal control is efficient as well as effective. I hope this is useful. Concept of a key control is very important, even though the regulators don't use it. I describe it and define it in my book on SOX, which I hope, if you're involved in the Sarbanes-Oxley compliance work, you will have seen and benefited from. I'll put a link to it in the description. Thanks. And go assess and rely upon the key controls.